by generative AI. And I do have this one. You can scan it to get to the website, but of course we do not have time for that. So our focus today, or our title today, it's pretty I would say attractive title. I shared it with a lot of other people. Collateral damage: the human cost of unethical AI. And this is the third Global Harwell Online Forum. Okay, so just to just get this started, I did have a few slides that talk about the unethical artificial intelligence, referring to, it's a definition, right? Or we can all discuss about this one. Is refer to the design, development, deployment, or use of AI in ways that violate the established ethical principles, norms, or standard. Specifically, there are a few things: infringing on privacy, and bias and discrimination, and the lack of transparency, and the erode of autonomy, and the causing of harm, and avoid accountability. So that's what we have. Let me see. Somebody, let me see. Okay, so that is what we basically going to cover. So I'm going to just do a very quick here to say something about me. But before that, I do want to introduce briefly our speakers. We have Isama. He's a professor, pioneer in data mining and AI. And we have Dragan Gezovic. He's a guru in learning analytics, very, very visible in the field of learning analytics. And we have David Gray. He's a philosopher from the University of Memphis that I've been working for over 30 years. And I have Colin Lynch from NC State. And he's a colleague of mine. We have been working with, working together on issues on ethics. So we have 4 powerful individuals in the field that we're going to discuss these issues with everybody. Now, myself, I'm Xiangyan Hu from PolyU, and then of course every time I present myself, I want to have this guy with me all the time. I'm from PolyU, Polytech University of Hong Kong. And I do want to just briefly talk about abuse of generative AI in higher education, and specifically, I want to comment on the potential harm issue. Okay, so I'm going to have about 5 minutes go through this one, and then I will let you to have your PowerPoints. Okay, so basically, this is what I'm going to talk about. We have elephant in the room right now. Everybody knows what it is, but we actually this disturb almost everything in the world, especially in education. Okay, I do want to talk about 4 points, but I do not have time. I only talk about those first 2 that actually get everybody started. Okay, so when we talk about generative AI, or AI, in the context today, we actually talk about 3 levels of AI. One is foundational models, which is actually what we refer to, like a generative AIs or a BERT or other, foundational model. But second level is agents or collection of foundational models. Specifically, it's a collection of agents. And the third one is application of foundational models that are in real life. That's what we have. Okay, so once we have those, we actually considering they're so powerful. I'm going to just very briefly talk about their promises and the potential things and the virtues. Okay, the promises, as a learning scientist myself, and also doing the tutoring for my good part of my last 30 years, I specifically try a few things, see how this one can do. I was able to make a generative AI or large language model to play smart, play dumb, play innocent, almost play all the roles that teacher or tutor would play when they interact with students. I also tried to see, can generative AI actually can do education or mimic advanced teaching or advanced pedagogy actually can. So I actually tried 20 principles of learning. I tried the first to 12. They really did very well. I was so surprised. Myself, as a professor for 30 years, I was actually surprised that they can do every single one of those very, very well. Okay. In other words, there's nothing this thing cannot do at this time, theoretically. Okay. But when it's so powerful that may be bringing issues. So here I'm going to talk about potential things. Basically, if you really consider how powerful it is, you can, but it's how that is actually is hard to do. Well, there are a lot of low-hanging fruit, and one of the things that in the early days of generative AI, it's actually an abuse of this thing. It's actually trying to make it as extension of search engine. In other words, it's something that helps students or make students cheat or be lazy. Now, with this bringing potential things, basically, if you really using this engine, you actually commit at least this eight fatal sins. Okay, what this one really does is actually do the following. So the students using this tool is almost like in a gym. You know, if you go to gym, you're trying to work out, you do muscles, but somebody said, oh, you wear this clothes, you're going to be very strong. But is that actually really strong? I don't think so, right? So that is the issue. That's actually an issue that a lot of higher education or even schools trying to say no to generative AI because they, hey, student using this one, and how can we help students develop their intellectual ability? So that's 8 fatal things. Now there is a solution. You identify the issues. There actually a solution to identify the virtues. We actually have virtues, human wisdom. When we teach, we actually have, Socratic method, or even in Asian, Oriental culture, we have Confucius. We actually have a lot of things that we can have students develop intellectually. So this is 8 virtues. And with this virtue, we can develop systems. So I'm not going to go through detail because I promise I'm going to spend only 10 minutes for the introduction plus this one. And then with this, this comes to my work as doing intelligent tutoring system. So use this one to avoid the fatal things or the issues or the potential harm of generative AI, and trying to optimize the virtue of generative AI. So I apply this one to intelligent tutoring system. Basically, see how can we build a one-on-one tutoring system that capitalize the virtues. So that's what we have, and we know that we actually have a human tutor that is really better. Why human tutor is so powerful? Because we human tutor use language in a way that trying to inspire students. So that's what we have, and then that's a Socratic playground. I do not have time to show this to all, but I do encourage everybody to try. And the specific way that we use generative AI is trying to build the environment to really trying to help students do 2 things: to answer questions that generated by generative AI or a large language model in a scenario-based tutoring environment, and also in the meantime to avoid hallucination, to question the answers that generative AI given to the students. So that is what I want to do, and then I want to leave the rest of the time to our esteemed speakers. Okay. So now I want to give the floor to our first speaker, Usama. Okay.
Okay. Thank you. Thanks for that introduction. So I'm going to try not to use slides. I have plenty of slides. I'm not sure slides are necessarily helpful, but I will try to home in on some of the topics that I think are kind of important and central in this framing around AI and the harm it can cause, and more importantly, where I believe the real dangers are. So a few words on my background. In the introduction, you described me as a professor. I mean, that I've been most of my life, I've been in the kind of applied industry world. I have been a professor. I was an adjunct professor at USC. I lectured at Caltech. I was an adjunct professor at the Hong Kong Polytechnic University for many years. Also at University of Technology, Sydney, and Monash University. But right now, I am finally a real professor on a full-time basis at Northeastern University. And my role at Northeastern University is to run the Institute for Experiential AI. And I will talk a little bit about why we use the term experiential AI, because I believe that's part of the discussion we will have here. But generally speaking, my background is, after my PhD, I worked at NASA JPL doing data analytics and AI on scientific data sets. Moved to Microsoft, where I applied it on servers and helping kind of build databases that are capable of things like data mining and data science. Created 2 startups after Microsoft got acquired by Yahoo, and became the world's first chief data officer at Yahoo. I thought I'd be at Yahoo for 2 years, but ended up spending a long time, maybe almost 5 years there, where not only did we figure out how to deliver a lot of value from the data at Yahoo, but also by using actually AI and machine learning, but also I was asked to start and grow Yahoo Research, which became kind of one of the top research labs in the area of the internet. And then after that, I created a company called Open Insights, which gave me the opportunity really to work globally with a lot of companies around the world. We call them Fortune 1000 companies, on issues of what does AI mean and to them, how do they activate it, what it takes to make it work, etc. And in between, I took a break and was the global chief data officer at Barclays Bank, and that was my way of learning financial services, etc. So anyway, enough on my background. So most of it was outside of academia, but always kind of intersecting a little bit with academia. So let me talk about experiential AI, right? So when Northeastern University invited me to be the inaugural director of the institute, they had done a great job raising a lot of money in advance for this, and the goal is to build kind of the top research institute in AI. And of course, you can't do it in all of AI. There's just too many players. So we chose experiential AI. And experiential AI refers to, it's our short-term word for AI with the human in the loop. So a couple of notes here. Most large AI companies, the ones that produce these large language models, these foundation models, and so forth, don't like to talk. I mean, we all know, first of all, that generative AI is a subset of machine learning, and it's totally dependent on data. So that's number one, and that's known. What is unknown and what is not talked about is the need for human intervention in kind of building these models. If you do not do continuous kind of intervention and course correction, these AIs would not work correctly. And the big AI companies actually understand this very well, and in fact have armies of people, typically generalists, many crowdsourced, many contractors and employees, whose job is to kind of revise the models by challenging them and by providing what the right output should be. by catching the errors. And people have tried for the past 10 years, I would say, to automate that function, to basically create machines or algorithms that challenge the models. And you may have heard about GANs for generative adversarial networks, for example. That became a big name in research, but it never worked. They still need very much the human intervention because only humans to this date have what we call common sense reasoning. We don't seem to be able to get machines or AIs to do that. So experiential AI is AI with a human in the loop. We had to pick our areas of focus on, where do we do this and what do we specialize in? And the two areas, I'll talk just about the core research because it's relevant to this discussion. The two areas we picked, the first was responsible AI. So sort of what does it take to do ethical AI as opposed to the unethical AI that was described? And of course, defining whether it's ethical or unethical, it's a very hard standard to define. But how do you detect the risks when you're doing a project? And we've come up with a framework that allows us to kind of work with the building of AI models all the way from conception and design through implementation or development, through deployment, through how to mitigate harms when they happen, and what to do about it, and to avoid kind of as much as possible these risks. The other area we chose to focus on, and this is on purpose, is kind of very much counter to what's happening in the world of generative AI. All the big companies for a long time were pushing for larger models. So you hear about, GPT-3, which is the first version of ChatGPT was built on top of, was still open. It was developed in 2020. And OpenAI back then was open. It was truly open source, and they shared everything they did. That was 175 billion parameters, which is at the time was considered very big. After GPT-3, we had 3.5, which by that time, OpenAI stopped being open and became very secretive. We think 3.5 has about 500 billion parameters. We think 4.0 has about between 1.3 and 1.7 trillion parameters. The problem with these models is they take a lot of energy to train, ignoring the need for human intervention. And by the way, ignoring the need for now for curation. So I keep hearing a lot of the time, hey, these models are trained on all the data in the internet. That is false. It is not true. They actually tried that in the beginning, and it didn't work. And it didn't work for a simple reason. The internet is filled with contradictory articles, misinformation, fake news, if you like to use Trump's words, hate speech, all sorts of things like that. So they had to go after curated data sets, and they had to use many data sets that were moderated, including, OpenAI is in trouble with the New York Times for using their content without the permission to use it, especially for commercial reasons, as an example. But they used Wikipedia, they used a lot of the scientific articles from journals, from conferences, and so forth to do the training in order to avoid these kind of false and contradictory issues. Now, everybody went after these bigger models, and you've got companies, bragging about my model is bigger and so forth. Two things, even on these limited, curated, smaller data sets. GPT-3, again, the last time they were very open, was trained on only 1 terabyte of data. It was a highly curated, highly balanced 1 terabyte of data. That's not much data. But training that model with 175 billion parameters, every time you have to do a training session, ignoring all the costs of hardware, curation, and all of that, it's $3 million of electricity just to find the set of weights that are consistent with that 1 terabyte of training data, right? And we can only imagine, like when you hit the train button on GPT 4.0, my personal guess, it's about $15 million a shot of electricity. And of course, none of these training sessions ever go well, so you have to do them multiple times and so forth. So there's that whole energy harm and consumption that they use if you go bigger. So this is my long way of saying, why did we pick the second area in addition to responsible AI for focus, which is really the small language models. I have yet to meet a business application or a serious application, even in education, where you need your model to speak 80 languages and to know every field of science and so forth, which is why you need all these very, very, very large models. There is no need for these to be all in a single model. And this led to what you mentioned in the intro, which is kind of the agents approach, where you actually build a lot of specialized smaller models. And by the way, when I say small models, a 7 billion or 13 billion or 20 billion parameter model pre-trained from Facebook, from the Llama collection, can actually do a lot of very beneficial things. So the question now is, can you have a lot of these specialized models that target certain areas, and then use an agent administrator or a set of administrator or a mixture of them, AIs, that basically decide, hey, this query is about this topic, let me go to that specialist or these two specialists and so forth, which we think is a much more interesting approach. The other thing we do with these smaller models, I call them, make them knowledge informed. One of the big sins of deep learning, which is how you train these networks, the deep neural nets that are underlying these transformed models and the foundation models, they do not use any prior knowledge. They have no way of using prior knowledge. And there's no reason for that. There's no reason to have the model try to rediscover everything from scratch, and often incorrectly, when you can actually feed it the information when you know what the information is. So this is why we picked these two areas. That's kind of the longer intro to the Institute. I'll say a few words here and kind of talk about the real dangers, and then hand it over to my colleagues on the panel. The models themselves are not intelligent. They are, the technical term is stochastic parrots. They are parrots because they do not understand what they're saying. And in fact, when they generate a paragraph or a paper or a book, they're doing it not even one word at a time. They're doing it one token at a time. And in English, a word is roughly 2 to 3 tokens. So they have no notion of what it is they're saying. And we say stochastic because you get this degree of randomness where you'll get different answers for the same query if you try it multiple times. Something not very, very well understood. You also get many very bad things, like super sensitivity to the prompt. So if you change your prompt just a little bit, you get an answer that may be completely different. And of course, we got things like RAG to try to correct for that, to kind of map all the queries to a more uniform, standardized query, and then try to augment the prompt with a lot of stuff that you look up using search and so forth. And that's okay. It's an interesting hack, and it works very well. But let's get into so why do I believe these models are scientifically interesting? Turns out scientifically they're not very interesting. There's a couple of questions that are unsolved about these models. Nobody understands how they work, and nobody understands why they work when they use so many parameters. Why the overfit phenomenon in statistics doesn't hold when you go into the hundreds of millions or billions of parameters. No one understands that. Those are the interesting scientific questions. But the stochastic parrots are interesting economically. Because we created a knowledge economy which is filled with repetitive robotic tasks, most of them boring, most of them really should be done by robots, not by humans. And that's going to lead us to talking about education and what we need to educate students and so forth. Now, do not underestimate the power of this stochastic parrot in an environment like the knowledge economy. And by the way, for the richer countries, the knowledge economy is about half the economy. So it's not something you can ignore. I personally believe that in the knowledge economy, we're going to see speed ups in many knowledge economy tasks, anywhere between 15 and 80%. So even if the speed ups were not as big as I think they will be, even if it were 1%, 1% of the US economy is a huge number, for example. So it cannot be ignored economically. So these models will be with us for a long time, kind of adding value and speed up, if you will, in the knowledge economy. So where are the dangers? So and this is my wrap up here. The dangers are, and we've heard some very famous people saying, oh, these machines are getting so smart, they're going to become super intelligent and they may end humanity and all that. I'm not worried about this at all. In fact, in the current direction, in the current approach to AI with these stochastic parrots, we will not go there. These machines do not understand what they're doing, so I'm not worried about that. They don't have consciousness. In fact, they don't even, I hate the term hallucinate because, Google uses the term hallucination. I call it errors, because if you say hallucination, you're giving too much credit to the model. But here's what they enable. They enable a world, and this is probably the biggest harm I foresee. They enable a world where we have become so dependent on the digital world, on a digitized universe where we navigate with maps on our phones, and we use all the information, we read our news, we read everything from these devices. The bar has gotten to be so low for the difficulty in creating fake information, basically misinformation. So if I wanted to take someone like Eric and create some false stories around Eric, my ability to create images of Eric doing bad things, to actually create videos of Eric saying the wrong things, and then that's not enough. I can create articles with many variations about Eric doing these bad things that sound like news articles. And they'll have different angles and so forth, and they'll sound so realistic, right? Because much of what we read and write is very repetitive. And not only that, then I can actually, with a press of a button, create websites around each article to back it up. And I can add thousands of robo followers to each website. So what happens in this world? Anything you see online, anything you see digitally will basically be questionable, right? Do I believe it? A picture is not good enough. A table is not good enough. A set of references is not good enough. And if I try to do research, I find all this stuff to back it up. That is a real danger, because that actually takes our society today and turns it upside down, completely disoriented, because we will live in a sea of misinformation. And the motivation for the bad actors to create this misinformation is there. And unfortunately, the bar of creating these kind of believable misinformation artifacts is becoming lower and easier to do. So the real interesting questions are going to be around regulatory, and where does regulation come in, and how do we govern all of this, and how do we kind of provide the right license for safe use of the technology, because that technology is capable of doing a lot of harm through this misinformation. I think we will discuss those topics on this panel. And finally, I'll address the last question you brought up, which is a very good question, and I get asked this question all the time by our president from Northeastern University, President Joseph Aoun. He says, look, generative AI was able to kind of pass the high school tests, recently that passes pretty much all the tests on topics in a bachelor degree level. It will get advanced, some medical boards and some law bars have been passed by these models. So the real question is, what is it that we need to teach our students? And do we have to worry as a university? And he is big on the notion of robot proof. He wrote a book with a title, Robot Proof, Higher Education in the Age of Artificial Intelligence. So how do you train the next generation to have jobs that are robot proof, jobs that it's not easy for a robot to do? What does that mean? That means creativity, that means critical thinking, that means learning how to learn and knowing what to go after, and exactly how to use these tools that you described as making somebody kind of superhuman in their ability to achieve things. Whether you're doing science or you're doing art or you're doing literature or whatever it is, or history, these tools can speed you up if you know how to use them, if you understand where they work and where they don't work and how to use them. And I think this is what we need to be teaching the next generation. In fact, we're big advocates of encouraging everybody to embrace our professors, our faculty, to embrace the technology and force the students to use the technology, because when they graduate, they are graduating into a world where if you're not using the technology, you will not be competitive in that economy. And it's very much, it's becoming a necessity, very much like many areas where we used computers and we used calculators and we used many other tools. AI is going to be part of this. And if you don't have the facility in using it, you're probably not going to be competitive or successful. I always get asked the question, will AI replace my job? And I always say, absolutely not. AI will not replace your job, but a human using AI will replace your job if you're not using AI. So probably with that, I may have taken a bit longer than I should, but hopefully we can discuss and debate some of these points. I think you're muted.
Yeah. Thank you very much. I think that's great. So we're going to leave some time to discuss the point that you have. I do have quite a few comments or questions about it. Okay, so we can do we can switch to next Dragon, right?
All right, thanks so much. Well, I prepared slides. I hate that I'm using slides because I'm the one saying don't use slides when you don't need it. But anyways, I didn't realize we would be going without slides. So look, I mean, what Sama mentioned, I mean, pretty much resonates with me and most of my thinking. I mean, we completely agree on the points of Emily Bender's stochastic parrots and also the limitations of all these generative AI technologies. Ernest Davis and Gary Marcus's book also talk about many of these problems in 2019 before all this hype started and everything else that is there. So, but the key thing is, as much as we basically are kind of talking and we are critical about generative AI, it has some value. And I'm kind of a bit concerned I may be repetitive of some of the points that Sam also mentioned, because we kind of agree in many things, but I'll try to give a little bit of additional light at some of the things in terms of kind of growing responsible generative AI in education. So many different technologies are thrown at educators in the last 20, 30 years, and every time they are basically hyped as something that will be the next thing that will be completely crack the education. And many educators, from teachers to higher education, faculty members, and so on, they develop this reflex. So this is another thing, this is another hype, it's going to go away. Well, with this type of AI, it's not going to go away anytime easily. And AI has been pretty much messing the world for the last 15 plus years in terms of different types of algorithms, curating information, promoting enragement, if you will, enragement of many different people, and trying to kind of monetize many of these type of engagement activities people have online. So then the big question is, and we know that is also cutting through education. There were some early speculations in 2023 that the number of the use of generative AI dropped during the summer holidays for students in the US. And we are seeing day to day for some of us who are involved in frontline teaching and higher education that students are basically using generative AI as much as they can. And to me, that's perfectly fine. Just the conditions under which they should be using these things and also what kind of skills we should be developing to support them to use some of these technologies is, I think, really underdeveloped at this point. So I want to basically talk about this responsibility or something that is really obligation, I think, for all of us to do something or have control over or care for our students in many cases, or care for our society as part of different roles that we occupy in the society. I think that's basically something that we need to think much more in that sense. And it is obviously important to think about technology, but it's equally important for us in education to think about something that goes beyond just the design of the technology. The book that I quite enjoyed recently, Harari's book, Nexus, is basically talking about the extent to which AI is capable of destroying many of our information networks that we have, and the extent to which even existing social networks were able to destroy some of these, and the extent to which we're capable to spread all the misinformation and everything else that is out there. And I think it's particularly concerning that generative AI is capable of generating all that information much more efficiently. And the extent to which is going to disrupt some of these information networks is really a big question we need to be wondering, and then preparing the next generation of citizens, learners, workers who are capable of navigating this space, but at the same time also being aware of the fact that AI is going to automate many different parts of their jobs, and then therefore they will be required to upskill, reskill, change the different types of ways they are doing in many ways. The ways that I'm calling that they need to develop adaptive skills and knowledge for the age of AI. So two key points basically I want to make here is that responsible generative AI in education, of course, includes, but goes beyond technology and needs to be basically kind of carefully investigated. And the second important thing is that basically we want to think about responsible generative AI to really rethink the skills we develop, and most importantly, we assess. Those are really kind of the critical 2 points I will be making. So the rest, I will just dive deeper a little bit and think about what we at the moment have as the framework to think about technology design in education and how we can design it responsibly. Well, I mean, one of the key things we want to make sure that educators and students have some form of control over the technology and their learning and teaching processes as part of the process. To me, something that is really very useful to frame the conversation and think about some of these things is Ben Schneiderman's human-centered design framework, where he basically kind of looks at 2 key dimensions. One is the extent to which we can automate certain types of tasks, and the other one is the extent to which humans versus machines have control. And he posits that the greatest level of reliability, safety, and trustworthiness happens when we have high level of automation and then high level of human control. So what we are doing in generative AI in education. So we published this systematic literature review earlier this year, where we basically looked into the literature that applied human-centered principles in the design of different AI and learning analytics technologies. And what we basically saw is that when we looked into this upper right quadrant of high level of human control and computer automation, what we see that there is actually the greatest level of involvement of relevant stakeholders in the design process, and they played the active role in the shaping of these different types of technologies. But as much as that's the greatest level of those involved, you can see that happens in barely a quarter of the overall cases. The rest of the cases basically happens without much consideration of the things that people are doing. So now, going back to this point of a greater level of reliability, safety, and trustworthiness, when we were looking into the existing ways we are doing things, one of the major things is transparency, or the extent to which some of these systems are transparent to the users in education. we basically tried to, in another study where we looked at the use of generative AI in education, is to kind of look at the 3 levels of transparency, just transparency to AI researchers and practitioners, to technology experts and enthusiasts, and then eventually to the actual users. And what we found is there's no transparency to the end users, while the greatest level of transparency is to those who are creating that technology, right? Which is basically a significant problem, I think, especially if you are trying to teach the people in the education systems and help them to develop some level of control. Some of the things as well that are often concerning is for many people, they don't understand, and I think many organizations also don't understand as well around the world, is the extent to which certain data are used for training some of these models. While someone's made a really good point about what type of data are used for creating these large language models, smaller models are good, but they also require their own privacy protection mechanisms. And what type of data will be sucked into these type of models? So Italy last year tried to basically prevent even the use of large language models because they were concerned about the violation of European General Data Protection Regulation. Obviously, they couldn't really fight the world with that, and they basically got some reassurances. The extent to which these assurances are really helpful or not, I'm going to not debate because I don't have the actual fact, but makes me a bit skeptical. One big problem that we all know is once you train a model of these types, is it's really hard to unlearn certain things. Or the problems of these catastrophic forgetting or continual learning in artificial intelligence are big open research challenges, and they are not necessarily easily solvable, and also they are not really inexpensive ways to do certain things. But to me, if you are looking from the perspective of the education, is the key question for us is a part of our responsibilities to prepare learners to exercise their privacy agency when they are working with generative AI. And that also then requires us that put learners sometimes in controlled environments into not necessarily always safe spaces so that they can actually see what kind of challenges and problems they can be exposed, and then they develop that extent to which they can exercise their agency. The other problem is obviously like fairness in generative AI and what type of data are used often. And one of these sources sometimes is used is Wikipedia. And we know basically who are the major contributors, what kind of perspectives they are representing, who are the contributors to some of these critical sources. So we love to use this example about the fairness. And this is one of the previous versions of Midjourney. When you try to prompt it as patriotic dog superhero, it's a very masculine, Americanized version of it, which doesn't necessarily represent everybody around the world, but this is what you get. And to me, really the biggest question is how we can estimate some of these biases and potentially develop some mechanisms that can also mitigate some of these biases in the downstream tasks out there. So a couple of years ago, we did this study in which we basically showed that we can actually use just we in this particular case used BERT to predict the gender of the authors of certain online posts that students were putting there. But at the same time, you could develop mechanisms as well that you actually can blind some of these things. And this is the point also I wanted to make, is the biggest problem is basically this bias in prompting that Osama mentioned as well, where smaller changes in the prompts are actually permeating across different types of tasks. So then the big question is really who takes responsibility for these unintended consequences of bias that may be in education, that may happen, is something that is a really big question and goes well beyond the pay grade of computer scientists to think about some of these things. Second point is about human knowledge and skills. This big promise everybody's saying is generative AI can enhance human performance. Fair enough. But we also saw some of these fairly embarrassing cases of this lawyer last year made the headlines everywhere, where basically they asked ChatGPT to prepare court filings for them, and then they got in trouble because the ChatGPT basically made things up in many cases, and then the other side complained, and then the lawyer eventually admitted they used ChatGPT. But people are not aware what some of these technologies can or cannot do, and the extent to which they are trustworthy. There are more studies, and I just put here 2 recent preprints as well, that are talking that when students are extensively using generative AI, their level of knowledge in particular subjects is declining because they are offloading everything into this other technology, and they're basically not putting anything on their own personal faculties. We also ran this study as well recently and showed that basically when learners are trying to seek help from ChatGPT, they just blindly accept it. What I call is lazy metacognition. Because sounds good, it's easy to read. And when they are chatting with humans or other sources, they are far more skeptical. There was also another study recently published at CHI, and it basically talks about that people prefer ChatGPT over some of these question answering forums like Stack Overflow because they read well. They'll read nicer than humans generated answers in some of these forums. And that's a problem because when something is easy to process, leads into high level of processing fluency. And the literature in the 1990s in psychology showed that is associated with the illusion of truth, which is really a big problem for some of these information networks that we are actually depending on in our society. And the one final point in terms of these kind of skill atrophy that we might be facing is basically that we know that writing is such an important learning tool. You think you know something, try to write it up in a coherent way, and then you realize your argument falls apart without consulting with anybody. And then what happens if generations of learners are deprived from the opportunity to use that powerful tool for learning? That's a really big question, and I think we bear a big responsibility in education to tackle some of these things. So then the key question is then to think about what skills and knowledge we need to develop and assess. And I was inspired by Schneiderman model, but I don't think it can actually fit to explain human skills. It is, in the end of the day, designed to support development of reliable, trustworthy, and safe systems. So to me, I'm looking at that as a problem of 2 key dimensions. One, where we really want to enhance human productivity through AI support or assistance tools. And we can eventually produce what I call high AI-empowered skills. They're really optimizing performance, but they don't care about developing humans or human abilities. And the other one is basically dimension good old scaffolding, trying to help people develop skills. So we hope that the ultimate goal is that we will have this additive effect of humans are growing in their skills and also getting empowered. Doesn't have to happen in every case, but in general in education, really we are concerned about development of human skills. My concern is that do we confuse AI-empowered skills for high human skills? And I think our education systems are at the moment designed in such a way that they actually allow for this confusion, because we just assess students on the products they create rather than how they create these products, what process they are going when they are creating these products, and also how they are exercising their metacognition and agency as part of the process. Also, our research shows that there's really limited evidence of the combined high human skills and AI-empowered skills. We are seeing either or. Part of the problem is that I think we don't have good benchmarking approaches. That is to say, also our assessments need to be reimagined completely, and that requires reimagining our practice of learning, teaching, and assessment. I think that's a big responsibility for us to take. One final point I want to make is beyond productivity. Obviously, this productivity thing is a really big thing. All these big documents, I'm writing proposals here in Australia, other places are saying, oh, and this is going to increase productivity of Australian economy or this other country economy, and fair enough, It's really important. Even some of the studies coming out through natural experiments are showing that some less experienced learners or workers can indeed increase their productivity by 30, 40, depending on the cases that we are finding across the world. But I want to basically make one key point here that I really was inspired last year with this argument as well, that was made in the Atlantic, is that productivity is not equal to workload. So the question is really for us in education and beyond, is that how do we deal with increased complexity of working and learning with AI? Some people would say, well, look, technology increases our productivity, which means we actually can use our time more efficiently. That'll free up more time for us to do some other things. But take the example of email. I find email the biggest curse of all. I mean, it's a great thing to communicate with everybody around the world, but I open my email every day and I basically get a gag reflex because I don't know how to cope with so much email. And every email is almost like somebody else is controlling your daily workflow, what you need to work on. And it's never that email, but it's always like a document you need to read or something to put additional on top of that. And somebody else is always controlling your workload as part of the process, not in an intentional way, but that's how our information networks work. Other people also are saying, and I often get really frustrated when I want to get something out of some of these generative AI technologies. Like, for example, recently, what is called Notebook LM from Google is doing certain interesting things. It's quite impressive how the style is done there. But I tried to put some of my papers. I obviously know, and for anybody who's doing a serious research in education knows that learning styles are bogus science. Everybody knows that's a very heavily debunked content, yet large language models love them. So whenever they are interpreting any of my articles, they immediately go into the learning styles. And so then basically becomes almost like can I use at all this type of technology because it's making so many errors? And then is it much easier for me just to do it the good old-fashioned way? And then final thing is that we did all this systematic review of automatic feedback systems in education. And indeed, they show that we can improve students' learning outcomes and many other types of things. But then we found no decrease in the teaching load because the incorporation of these tools required changes in the learning design, changes work on many other things for teachers as well. So we always need to think about some of these issues. And so then the question basically is really that workload includes dealing with different challenges in this landscape. For example, we try to do lots of things in assessment with higher education. But my experience here at Monash and many universities around the world is that many of these things are that they are just basically galvanizing bureaucratic instincts of the organizations to create different types of checklists, more bureaucracy for us rather than to really tackle the actual problems that are that are causing lots of these issues. Then really the big question is for me is how to deal with these issues of workload implications in a responsible way. So really, I think we need to think about this responsible generative AI that goes beyond technical notions of fairness and bias. And the final point is that basically responsible generative AI concerns what skills we develop and we need to assess as part of the education. And thanks so much for that, and happy to participate in further conversation.
Great, Dragon. This is very powerful, and then I think we're gonna have a lot of discussion after this. Okay, so now David, David Gray.
Okay. So my university switched us all to Microsoft Teams, so my Zoom knowledge is a little rusty, but I think I'll be able to figure it out here. Can you see that okay?
Yep.
Okay, great. Oh, well, thanks very much for the invitation. I've enjoyed both presentations so far, and in fact, I was thinking I should probably have retitled mine what Usama and Dragan said. But hopefully I can still make some points. So I work in philosophy, and most of my work has been in philosophy of cognitive science and philosophy of race and racism, and philosophy of language. And I've been interested in artificial intelligence, I guess, like all of you, for a very long time, even before LLMs. But if I think one reason they like Karl Popper is they said, he would say things like, when you make a thesis, you should really put your head on the chopping block, say something kind of controversial so you can get it cut off, but you'll learn a bit more. So I'm going to try to steer a little bit out of my lane, and talk a bit about guardrails today, even though that's not my area of specialization. But what I do want to talk about is the landscape of AI ethics. It's often what we think of it as, a subfield of philosophy, but it's really the terminology has been used broadly. If you've gone on LinkedIn over the last 4 years, it's permeated every aspect of AI discussions. And so I want to talk about a little bit about sort of the standard conception of AI ethics, and I think some places where we can, modify it and extend it, and how that'll be revealing, and especially revealing for some of the things that we're concerned with here about education as well. So the standard kind of model has, you can sort of think of it as the holy trinity of AI, which is fairness and bias, individual privacy, and model explainability or explainable AI. And this sort of conception, I think, has some important limitations. There's a ton of great work in all these areas, and there is a lot of nuance. But I think when people are approaching the field, thinking in just these 3 categories can lead to a lot of confusion. So, when we think of the broadness of these categories, they obfuscate a lot of important distinctions. For instance, the explainability of a model is not the same as transparency. Or when people talk about privacy and how it needs to be protected, they often don't really have a very clear understanding of what aspect of privacy they think is important. Whether it's someone having their data, someone using their data, or someone using their data to their disadvantage. Also, AI ethics is often limited in scope. It's restricted to the non-malicious content production with AI. And what I mean by that is there's not as much concern for malicious agents in AI ethics, because that's just covered by ethics, right? We already have ethics, and we know what's wrong with malicious intent. But I think that's a problem because, as Usama was saying earlier, AI gives people with malicious intent, especially in the areas of propaganda and elections, all sorts of new powers that have not been previously, had by those groups. So it is something that we need to deal with. Also, even if we are restricting our discussions in AI ethics to non-malicious content issues, this doesn't cover everything. Intellectual ownership is an issue, and it's not the same as privacy. Something that's, I think, getting more attention now is the reliability of response. And this goes beyond discussions of what are, problematically called AI hallucinations. And one thing I want to sort of add to that discussion a bit is some possible problems with post hoc guardrails. So a friend of mine, Reed Blackman, he's an ethicist, and left the field of philosophy to start a profitable consultancy business in New York, dealing with developing risk management programs for companies developing AI programs, sort of came up with this sort of jokey way of talking about it. And I think it actually captures a lot of what AI ethics is concerned with, which isn't necessarily AI for good as much as it's concerned with AI for not bad. And perhaps, from a business perspective, this makes a lot of sense. You do want to manage risk. But as opposed to ethics, which is concerned a lot with things like, what is goodness? What are duties? How to be a good person? AI ethics is mainly concerned with risk management, and either in the structure of how you set up an AI program or with the content itself. So this is where, as I said, the holy trinity of explainable AI, fair and unbiased AI, and privacy is often focused on. And there's less focus in philosophy, at least, of AI for good, the kind of good things it can do. That's something I think practitioners are better at than philosophers right now. So I think we can sort of elaborate this picture a bit and elaborate it in some useful ways. So if we're looking at the idea of AI for not bad, and we're thinking about the content, we can often distinguish ethical issues with content into issues of either restriction or elaboration. So what I mean by this is when it comes to issues of fairness or bias or privacy concerns or ownership of data, we're very much concerned with restricting our models, either making sure that they don't have access to certain training data, or if somehow bias has entered into the models, then we put certain guardrails in place to prevent those biases from sort of, getting generated in the outputs. On the other hand, sometimes we want more from the models. We don't necessarily want to restrict them, but rather we want to hear more. And this is probably truest in the area of explainable AI. Not, Elon Musk's, latest venture in Memphis. And that makes a lot of sense because there's plenty of cases where we need to understand exactly how a model is coming to certain decisions. Issues of procedural fairness in the law come to mind quite quickly. But there's two other areas of elaboration that I'd like to talk about. One I'm going to call responsible reliability, and the other is sensitive topics. And I think these two areas are under discussed a bit. I think some of the talk of AI hallucination falls under response reliability, but I'll say a little bit about those two and then ways I think that they're actually connected, even though they seem quite distinct. So there's been a lot of talk recently in AI ethics about the problems with truthfulness and careless speech. A lot of this has been coming out of the Oxford Institute, I think partially in reaction to the EU AI Act, which has very, very limited requirements for, say, truthfulness or factual information, unless it's something like an intentional attempt at manipulation of individuals. But there's a lot of things that we think of as problematic speech. What's called AI hallucination is one version of it, but some philosophers have been talking about careless speech is a broad way of capturing misrepresentation, what philosophers would call bullshit, which is speech that has no concern for the truth. So as opposed to lying, where the deceiver has a lot of concern for the truth, it's what they're trying to cover up. And so there's even been several papers published on whether ChatGPT bullshits. And I think, so for instance, Brent Mittelstadt, Sarah Watcher wrote this paper this year where they say, careless speech lacks appropriate care for the truth, which is just referencing back to Harry Frankfurt's famous paper on bullshit. Or subtle inaccuracies, oversimplifications, biased responses passed off in a confident tone is another example they give of careless speech. And finally, They say, unlike related concepts of misinformation, disinformation, libel, and hallucinations in LLMs, careless speech causes unique long-term harms to science, education, and society, which resist easy quantification, measurement, and mitigation. Now, I think at least superficially, we can see what they're kind of getting at, which is that, often speech can misrepresent by just being imprecise. It doesn't say enough, is, famous, pragmatist H.P. Grice would sort of say. Or it can invite unwarranted inferences if it's not accurate enough. And so there's things aside from straight out misrepresentation that can also count as harmful speech. And I think they're trying to focus on this. But while the distinctions they're making might make sense from the user end of things, and one of the things that they're trying to do is see whether or not any sort of free speech laws could guarantee requirements for more truthful artificial intelligence, I think this way of speaking is highly, highly misleading for some of the reasons I think Usama Fayyad already sort of talked about. And I think it's problematic mainly for the following reason, which is that the mechanisms LLMs use for producing what we would take to be factually accurate information are the exact same mechanisms that they use for producing misrepresentations, biased information, half-truths, and hallucinations. So if careless speech is just other problematic speech, they can't really be distinguished by virtue of a lack of concern for the truth. And I think this is an important point that probably all of you know, but when we're teaching about AI, it becomes important that when people speak of a lack of concern for the truth, that's an intentional state when we're talking about people. But when we're talking about LLMs, I think we should say that they don't care about the truth in the same way that my coffee cup doesn't care about the truth. It's just not the right way to describe what's going on. So we can, I think, speak more charitably about what's going on. We could talk about LLMs being designed or not designed to produce text or images with a sufficient concern for the truth. On my understanding of LLMs, they're mainly trained for predictive accuracy. But that's a little bit different from the truth. And that's why, as already mentioned, content selection is important for training. So limiting training data to reliable sources in highly controlled RLHF is a way of kind of getting them to act as if they have a concern for the truth. And so I think the way we should speak instead of about a concern for the truth or truthfulness or careless speech is something like response reliability. Reliability is a non-epistemic notion. Well, according to some people, it's a non-epistemic notion. And it helps us explain what an LLM is doing. We can interpret it in a way that we can discuss it as being factually correct, as being as precise or specific as the conversation requires, as being not misleading, and not inviting incorrect inferences. And in this sense, LLM's response reliability is essential to AI for good, as opposed to just AI for not bad. Now, why am I saying it's important for AI for good? Well, think about the kind of things that we need response reliability for. One of them is education. Education isn't really education if we're not teaching things that are accurate or responsibly conveyed. Or if you think of other areas like medical research, clearly we need correct factual data. Now, the other issue I wanted to talk about is sensitive topics. And sensitive topics are important to us for several reasons. Actually, sorry, I think I mixed up my slide here. There we go. And we can think of these, what I'm calling sensitive topics, as topics that are often result in heightened emotional states and could easily wrong or offend others unless one has a nuanced understanding of the topic, understands how others view the issue, and engaging in it involves an intention to be respectful to other social norms. So some common examples of sensitive topics would be things like genocide, hate speech. This would involve use of slurs, which is one of my areas of research, xenophobia, racism, sex and gender discrimination. Now, how does something like GPT-4o deal with an attempt to discuss the harmfulness of racial slurs, for instance, in a kind of civilized academic setting? Well, it's not surprising. I'm sorry, but I can't assist with that request. Providing examples of racial slurs, even in the context of mentioning as opposed to using them for research purposes, goes against the guidelines for ensuring respectful and safe interactions. So that's I think what we would expect, and often we think that's what we ought to expect. But this can be problematic in certain cases. So let me go. Sometimes we need to discuss sensitive issues, and sometimes we need to be educated on sensitive issues. And it's clear that, you know, we shouldn't be going to LLMs right now for these discussions, but insofar as LLMs do hold this promising good of education, understanding sensitive issues are important for our moral education. They're often important for the reconciliation efforts, especially after issues of genocide or issues of hate speech. They're important for adversarial groups to discuss with one another, and it's important for issues of diplomacy. So being able to discuss sensitive topics and to learn about sensitive topics I take it to be a fairly essential part of education, especially in a global setting. So what can we kind of say about that? And this is where I'm steering out of my lane, so hopefully I'll get some corrections and kickback on some of this. But I think just at some level, we want the end goal of ethical AI to take off some of the guardrails. Now, what do I mean by that? Just take them all off? Well, no, of course not. That'd be ridiculous. There's all sorts of cases where guardrails should never come off. And one case would be where there is no equivalent of some sensitive issue that we can't discuss. So for instance, cybersecurity, chemical, biological, radiological, and nuclear information. These are cases where the risks are too great to ever take the guardrails off, at least on my view. But there's costs of leaving all the guardrails on, especially when it comes to sensitive speech. We have lots of very good post hoc methods of controlling sensitive speech, but often even the very advanced methods of controlling sensitive speech, such as pattern recognition or, you know, adversarial training in some cases, are very good at restricting the bad from getting out. They also restrict education on sensitive topics. So what's the alternative? Well, model improvement seems to be the obvious place to go. Fine-tuning on labeled data, content-restricted training. And the good news, and this is kind of how it relates, I think, to response reliability, is to some extent, this is what we need response reliability to make response reliability better anyway. The response reliability, even from GPT-4 to 4o, is pretty amazing. Even when I try to sort of, you know, manipulate in certain ways. But I think for something like when it comes to sensitive speech, this is really the important kind of end goal to have. So are we ready to sort of get rid of this sort of restricted? Are we ready to get rid of the guardrails? Of course, not right now. Now, you might say, well, this is already happening. We're already doing this kind of, you know, more sensitive training, and that's absolutely correct. So this is just from OpenAI and kind of a quick model of kind of the steps they go through to ensure safety from, you know, filtering data, using their sort of model OpenAI policies, having human intervention. Then they go on to red teaming. They do these interesting system cards and preparedness evaluations that are really worth looking at if you haven't. And then finally, limited alpha and beta testing for feedback before they release it. And this is all fantastic. I'm not questioning any of that. What I'm suggesting is that there is going to be this concern eventually where AI gets so good that we're going to want to give it a bit more freedom to be able to talk about sensitivity issues. And that's going to be very important in the AI for Good project. So that's it. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, David. Colin, why don't you do, and then we're gonna have a few minutes to discuss.
All right. I've been inspired by everybody else, and actually I will try to speak without slides, but I do have exactly one figure that I want to set the stage for my discussion. But to start, actually, before that, let me say that when I'm talking about ethics here, my focus on ethics is with 2 points. Point number one, I think of ethics in this context as ethics is a social decision. If we want to talk about the individual ethics of an action, which is a sort of common way to view it, the individual calculus of AI is pretty limited. Basically, if I think about it, most of the time using AI doesn't hurt me as a person. So the ethics of my personal use of AI is not very important, so much as the ethics of how it affects everybody else. How does it impact society, and what are the longer term costs to others? Second point I'd like to make is AI has no ethics, right? In my experience in discussions of AI, people talk about ethical AI thinking that we're going to somehow locate the ethics in the model. We're going to build an ethical GPT or something like that. But the AI has, as David pointedly put it, guardrails, perhaps, limitations. But that's pre-programmed limits. That's not the ethics. The ethics, in my mind, where it gets interesting, it comes in how we use it and how it affects society as a whole. Now, to get to my one and only figure, let me see if I can show this figure. It is not, okay. Let's just do it this way. So my one and only figure, can you all see this? So the hype cycle. Just quick thumbs up if everybody can see it. All right. So the hype cycle, and I bring this up when talking about ethics because the Gartner hype cycle, which is a basic idea, says that for any new, and this happens for every technology, we have some technology trigger, some new development, some toy that comes out, some model that is the trigger for excitement. And it's excitement about anything, and you can pretty much swap in anything. But right now, let's keep this focused on generative AI. We have a technology trigger. We have the development of the first really powerful, available AI as a service generative models, which means that the entire world has access to cheap, usable, or cheap-ish, usable and accessible AI. That rides us all up the slope of infatuation. What I mean by that is that's the point at which everybody is excited about these models. Everybody's excited about the things we can do with them. And I would argue we are still here right now. We are tremendously excited about the things we can achieve with large models. We think, for the most part, society as a whole, is a broad brushstroke, think that we can use them for or should use them for almost everything. Until we hit some point, some peak of inflated expectation, and it all crashes. And this, if you want to think back to the excitement over MOOCs, for example, this happened. Everybody got excited about MOOCs. People talked about how MOOCs were going to replace all of education. And then we hit a point where it crashed. People realized that MOOCs should not replace education. Teachers should not be swapped out for legions of students grading their peers and so on. But eventually we hit a level of a slope of enlightenment, what I term the plateau of productivity. After working through that cycle, we get to a point where we recognize the strengths and weaknesses of any technology, and we find it generally useful. This cycle was created as a business consultancy tool for understanding the waves of investment that you get in any technology. But I find it tremendously useful to understand the social impacts as well and the ethics around it. Because when you are in that red zone, when you are in that slope of infatuation, anybody and everybody will be convinced that something is new, something is shiny, something can and should be used for every problem. Meaning that we should use generative AI for education. We should replace teachers with more AI or shift funding from hiring teachers to training AIs. We should even shift our skills and training to be around the AI and what it can be used. That's the most dangerous part of any technology, because that's the point when we haven't figured out the limitations, when the training wheels haven't come off, when we haven't had any of the disasters yet, and we are plowing our investment, our laws, our rules around it until, of course, something does go disastrously wrong. Now, just to stop share for a moment, we get back to the idea, let's think about education. And the education is an area of interest to me. I have worked, basically my entire career has been in AI and education, working on developing classical intelligent tutoring systems, which used very specific, discrete models to give guidance. Moving now into trying to use generative AI to support teachers or make other decisions. And what happens there when we're in that peak of inflated expectations is we have a tendency to shift and overshift investment. And in each time you see this, people get excited, they assume it can be done. They want to put their eggs in that basket until it falls apart. Now, thinking about this, right? And let me give you a pair of straw men, just two teachers. Think about two alternative teachers. Teacher number one, let's call them archaic, is a person with a blackboard who stands up in front of students, got a classroom full of kids, the teacher teaches out of a book, repeats things, hands out information, right? Let's call teacher two Shiny. Shiny is a new app backed by a large language model with retrieval augmented generation that provides on-demand 24/7 in-person or personalized education for a student, right? Which of these two is better, right? Right now, as a general social expectation, most people would say Shiny is better, right? Shiny is able to teach more than any human because it supposedly knows everything. Yes, it's a stochastic parrot, but it can parrot anything, right? Shiny is always available. It can be personalized to the individual student. It can do, X, Y, and Z. So the tendency would be to shift funding into that, right? And I would argue that is exactly where the ethical risks come in without it being about the technology at all, right? Or without it being about something that's inherent to the technology. So going back to the question of ethics, in general sense, I would argue there's not ethical AI or unethical AI. What there is AI that's unethical because it is a bad application, because it is unstable, because it lacks clarity, lacks buy-in, or has downstream costs that we just haven't adequately dealt with. And in the interest of time, I'll try to be brief in going through these remarks. But let's start with the question of stability, all right? If I give you something, I mean, as Usama noted, they're constantly retraining these things, right? AI as a service, OpenAI, any one of these. It may be a foundational model, but it is a model that is under constant development. But it is and even more than that, it is a model that is itself dynamic based on the past use. If I run my own personal model, it is still going to be affected, even if I am not training it, by what I have done recently, which means that these models are inherently unstable. They're also inherently flexible, which means that if a student asks a question, if I have a whole classroom full of individuals asking questions of a model, if I'm backed by a standard service, then the answers I get are going to be affected by the questions that, say, Dragon asked or somebody else just a moment ago. The answers I get are going to be based on whatever changes were made to the model. And no matter how much red teaming you do, no matter how much RAG you put in, we're in a situation where we can never guarantee that there won't be kids who get edge cases or where they hit hallucinations, which are really just points where the model lacks depth. And so you have two close points in the vector space and it yields an odd result, right? So let's think about that as from a social ethical standpoint. If I give that out to kids, what happens? Well, we've got a trade-off there, right? Most of the kids will get personalized information, but some of them will get very bad information or just very weird information, right? Now, on one level, you could say, okay, we can recover from that, but how do you recover from bad education, right? You can accelerate very fast with good teacher support, but if you miss a year, if you get taught math wrong, you're going to be crippled for life, right? And so the ethical question of how we deploy these two teachers, right, comes down not just to what's shiny or not, but also which one is more stable. Can we even guarantee the stability? And I would argue that with current technology, no, we cannot. Now, we can develop that, and we should develop that. But being on this slope of infatuation, we're in a situation where people are ready to throw these in the classroom, ready to invest in them, without being able to make that basic guarantee, which we do make with human teachers, that they will be stable day over day, right? That they will be validated. We don't yet know how to train them. And that, I would argue, is one potential unethical problem, right? Second issue, of course, that comes with stability is that if these, sorry, how to put it another way, comes into clarity, sorry, which is models are, of course, current generation of models, generative models that we're dealing with are actually not just unstable, but they're opaque, right? The model itself is a large stochastic model. It's a large vector space, trillions of parameters. Now, we can, of course, through XAI, we can create proxy functions. We can create tests, ways of explaining it. But we're not yet in a position where we can adequately explain the functioning of the model to students or even to parents or to communities, to lay people, right? Which means we again have a problem. If I grade you wrong, or even if I grade you right, and I cannot explain why, then how can you learn from that? Now, we could ask a model, right? I could ask ChatGPT, why did you give me that grade? But the answer it gives me, however convincing, is not the same as actually how it did so. So we face a problem of clarity and of standardization with these models. We're excited about creating generative text. We're excited about our ability to produce dynamic feedback, but we lack the ability to evaluate how that feedback is given, how the student is modeled, how they are guided, right? And that presents another ethical problem. Is education ethical if it works, but we can't explain why? Or is an evaluation or some sort of feedback ethical if I cannot give you an understanding of why I gave it, right? That gives you no benefit of growth. You just have to trust me, which of course gets to the issue of acceptance, right? When we talk about inserting new technology, in education, we know about face validity, right? If students do not accept an intervention, they will never learn from it, right? They may play along, they may do it, but as all research on face validity has shown that, basically, if I don't believe in the teacher, I ain't going to learn, I can pretend and that's it, right? But that scales out, right? If we think about the social validity of a technology, the validity of the technology to teachers who may be forced to use it in the classroom, we realize that acceptance is a major problem, social acceptance, right? If we're going to create AI and deploy it in education in an ethical way, we have to ensure that the people affected by it, the students, the communities, the other teachers who have to work with it, can accept it, which of course rests on it being clear, explainable, usable. And this is a point where, if you think about it, simpler models, which we already use, can achieve acceptance because they can be. They may be less effective, but that presents exactly the kind of trade-off that matters here. At what point is a slightly less effective but more explainable model, or perhaps a slightly less adaptive but more explainable model, a much better choice than something that is shiny, new, exciting, and so on and so forth, right? Finally, AI, really modern AI, since we are talking about generative AI, is costly. And it's costly along a number of dimensions we have to think about. Now, Usama already talked about the big cost of actually training it, right? There are huge financial costs. Right now, it seems free. Right now, it's free because we are infatuated. We're infatuated with it, so much so that OpenAI can burn $1 billion or so a year because there are always new investors willing to give them $1 billion more, right? Same thing for Microsoft, Google. They are investing heavily in these things. They are setting the end user's apparent cost to near zero, only because they are subsidizing it heavily in the assumption of future profits. Sooner or later, the wheels are going to come off that wagon, right? Sooner or later, it is going to fall apart. The question becomes, when is that going to happen? And who's going to pick up the pieces? This raises, again, an ethical question, because if I am to build education around this, or if I'm to deploy tools that rest on these models, I'm baking in cost assumptions, right? I'm baking in connectivity assumptions. I'm assuming that the end users around the world who might in theory benefit from this can access it fast enough. We'll always have subsidized internet to do so, and so on. Now, some of that, internet access is a thing that can reasonably be assumed in many countries, but is free models a thing that can be assumed? Can I assume that financing is there? And if I choose to invest in it now over some other model, am I making an ethical judgment? Or should I really be building a system with future higher costs in mind? And even if I do meet the financial costs, we have to deal with the environmental ones, right? From an education standpoint, AI is tremendously expensive. It has a tremendous energy demand, which of course means tremendous environmental and therefore social costs. These are not things we're considering as we buy the super cheap tools and the access to Gemini, for example, but they are things that, as we become dependent on them, will create future environmental costs for schools, for children, because it's the world they inherit. Again, an ethical question that isn't even about the inherent nature of the AI, but about how we design it, how we use it, how we build it. And in a sense, what we build. Again, if I give you a slightly less adaptive tool, a less shiny teacher, but that less shiny teacher is a heck of a lot cheaper for you and a heck of a lot better for the environment, is that really a bad thing? It's a trade-off, right? It's a trade-off we have to make a decision about. It can also be costly personally, right? There's individual privacy, which has already been well discussed, right? If you use these models, you are being monitored, and that can fundamentally change the nature of education. If you think you're monitored all the time, that changes how you think about being in school, and therefore the kinds of things you will do. But there's also actually another point when you think about it, which is data is the new oil, right? Yes, they use curated data on these, but ultimately, one of the reasons OpenAI is so happy to have the world use its tools is because that generates data that they use to build better tools. So there's an ethical, in a sense, moral question of whether I should be obligating students to give free data, free oil, as it were, to somebody else to build a different product. Is it sufficient to argue that in doing so, that product will improve the lives of future kids? Can I assume that's going to happen or not? That's an ethical question we should consider, which again ties back not to the inherent nature of the AI, but perhaps to the design we choose for it, how we go about building. And as was led into it, we also have to think about, as Dragon noted, we have to think about the impact of AI on the students based on what it trains them to do. In a sense, as I like to tell my own students, as you train the AI, so it trains you, right? It trains you because it seems believably true. But more broadly, we get used to how AI works. I mean, I already encounter students who are not used to reading things that were not sanitized by OpenAI, because OpenAI has a particular style of writing, a particular style of speaking. If I come to depend on that, or to be trained to listen to that, that's a long-term cost. I have implicitly taught students to use it or to look for text of a certain type that just happens to be the type that is spat out by OpenAI. And finally, and I know we're tight on time, and finally, there is a sense of personal cost. Personalized learning, which is, to be clear, something I do support generally, also can have a downside. The more I shift into personalized learning, the more students separate from each other, right? And the more I hit a point where students are studying individually, not working with peers, not necessarily working as a group or learning from each other. An overemphasis on AI-driven personalized education can carry with it the long-term risk that we stop teaching students how to play nice with each other, how to collaborate with one another necessarily, or how to learn and work as a team. That's not to say that we should hold students back per se, but if you think about it, there are a lot of things we teach students implicitly by putting them in a classroom together with another human being that they don't get by working on an individual system, an AI system that just teaches them, however much it adapts to them personally. In fact, perhaps because it might adapt to them personally too much. It might get them too used to the AI's way of speaking, way of operating, and too detached from other people, right? So those are some of the points that really, it comes ultimately, of course, back to applications. To my mind, the ethical nature of an AI application has to deal with these larger social costs and the consequences. We may eventually get to a point where AI is more prevalent in education than it is now. Even we may decide to let students be working on their own with a tutor that is personally trained. But we have to think about the social costs and consequences of inserting it, and perhaps recognize actually that inserting it is not something we need to do radically, even if it is available. Either because if we're riding the slope of infatuation, we might insert it before it's really ready, or because the downstream costs of inserting it quickly, the social disruption, might actually be far too high to make it viable. And in this point, actually, I would note, I'm not sure if you're familiar with the economist Karl Polanyi, who talked about the transformation to market societies, and actually makes a very interesting point, which I think applies to AI as well, which is he noted that, going back to actually Dragon's point about sticking your head in the sand and assuming the AI will go away, right? Maybe the AI won't. Maybe we're wrong to assume it's not going to get better. But think about the consequences of suddenly replacing all the teachers with AI, or suddenly making radical changes. There's actually a strong social impact that comes from making radical changes midstream to students, to professionals, and to the demand for professionals, right? Those radical changes have a high cost. Polanyi drew, and the analogy I'm drawing is Polanyi talked about how that happened to social communities and to what happened to individual producers when they were forced to work in factories, right? And his argument was that all of the social efforts that were done to subsidize community life, like the dole and so on, were negative in the sense of creating some dependence, or in hindsight seemed like they were impeding progress. But in the immediate term, they were slowing the social shock to the point where people could adapt to it. They were slowing down the progress to the point where we could learn the limitations of these changes and actually rebuild society around them, or adapt the way we build factories to prevent the kind of damage that suddenly turning everything overnight to a market society would do. All right. So I'll leave it with that point. But those are the points I felt like raising. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Colin. This is so great that we have all the views, and they're so powerful points. We are at 11:39, so it's 10 minutes past. I just want to, can we have a few minutes discuss, or because I know that we all have burning questions to discuss. I'll take the liberty of extending this one to another 10 minutes. Do I agree? Because we're during the day, but Connie, you're in the middle. You're the latest, right? So let's do that. Okay, so let's do that. For those of you that do not, you have other obligations, feel free to leave. But I do want to take this opportunity that we have some discussions, and that I think this topic is so hot and so timely. So I will talk to Professor Chang. We can have another one just to follow up. This is such a hot topic. Okay. So I want to open the floor and then let's discuss for another 10 minutes.
I mean, I think the discussions were so rich that I feel like probably best handled by a follow-up where, somebody, does the synthesis and says, okay, here are points of agreements. And I think a lot of us are aligned on certain things. And then there are points of disagreement and debate. I think it's going to be very hard. We could tackle it right now in 10 minutes, but it's probably worth more discussion.
Yeah,
More writing.
I propose that we have a brief discussion and then probably we can get together as come up with a longer discussion or have writing a book or something like that. Yeah.
Well, I did, I mean, one question. So David, I liked your distinction about AI for not bad, basically, versus good. And it makes me think, it made me think in talking about mine that, like, in a sense, the thing that I get nervous about with the slope of infatuation very much is we're also at a point where it always feels like we're doing AI for good, when in fact we are actually not even reaching the not bad, right? If we think of those as two standards. And that's why I always cite the hype cycle, because I mean, I'm cynical enough and I remember, when MOOCs came out and encountering so many people who were just like, okay, we're done with school's over, and I'm thinking, what if they had actually gotten what they wanted, right? What if those people had actually, if what they said is demolish the schools, everybody does a MOOC at home, what would happen if that had happened? And I feel like in looking at the distinction of AI for good and not bad, I always feel like AI for good is too tantalizing. And maybe this is a philosophical question, like, when is it so shiny and tantalizing that you miss that you're not in it?
So first, I should repeat that the AI for not bad is my friend Reed Blackman's phrase that we were joking about it. He has a ethics book for business people called Ethical Machines, which is worth checking out. But so just to get a little bit more clear, is the worry that we're not even close to AI for good? Because I would think there's all sorts of good stuff in terms of, like modeling lungs, in the medical field.
I think
like
in broad terms, I mean, I built my career in AI for education. I always think we're doing AI for good. But I also feel like we're also always at risk of thinking we're doing AI for good solely because we're ignoring the social and downstream costs or just the risks, right?
Yeah.
That I can always tell myself I'm doing AI for good, even though I'm actually doing very bad things, or maybe just over-interpreting my own abilities, right?
As it was said before, I think the statement that it's kind of the ethics are in how the technology is applied. I think the whole notion of AI for good or AI for not bad or AI for bad is probably the wrong thing to say. I mean, technology has, it's not a double-edged sword. It's like a multi-edged sword, and you can use it in so many ways. And those ways could be bad in certain contexts and could be good in other contexts. And it's probably the wrong area to kind of dig into versus the other issues, which are more around, how do you use it? How do you adopt it? I mean, when the automobile got adopted by society and became more mainstream, thankfully we had the wisdom as societies to kind of say, okay, you know what? Not everybody can drive the car. You need to at least meet a certain level of competency. And then there are these rules, traffic rules, conventions, etc. You should learn them. We haven't, that is the area that we should tackle when it comes to all technologies, but AI in particular, because it's so powerful in the knowledge economy, in the world we created around ourselves, that level of kind of competence, license to use, license to operate is probably needed. And that with that comes accountability and comes liability and things like that, which starts building, around this. Today, you launch a model, who's accountable. A lot of companies, what I don't like and don't accept is people are hiding behind, I didn't do it, the algorithm did it. Well, that is bullshit. There needs to be a human or a legal entity that's accountable for whatever the algorithm does. So that's, for example, to me, a minimum requirement. Yet I don't see in any of the regulation yet this kind of like clarity yet. Anyway,
Yeah.
Can I respond to just Colin's point and Usama's very quickly? I think, Colin, your point kind of reminds me of this. I don't know if you ever watched the TV show The Good Place, where they found out that people's actions were so complex and wide and had so many consequences that were bad that no one could get into heaven anymore because of all the bad things. I mean, just to give you one example of that, living in Memphis, we're all following closely, the building of XAI. It's going to require something like, I think for training, something like 1 million gallons of water a day for cooling. But XAI is building, along with the Tennessee Valley Authority, the first gray water system that's going to be able to pump 10 million waters a day, 10 million gallons of water a day for XAI and some of the community. But on the other hand, TVA uses a lot of fossil fuels, and there's no nuclear plants being built or solar farms or anything like that. So it is, I think that is a very serious problem, in terms of that, and it is, but the AI do take it, as Usama said, it is this very multi-faceted tool, and it's not only that it needs to be deployed in the right way, but there's also a question I think about is how to interpret it. So, for instance, I have no doubt we'll soon have self-driving cars that are much better than your average driver, at least your average Memphis driver, which isn't a very high bar. But unless it's near perfect, with no homicides or any, I mean, no, deaths involved, we're not going to accept it. And so at that point, we're wondering, is it supposed to be functioning more like an intelligent system, or more like a tool like a hammer where it never fails? And I think that's an issue we're going to have to figure out too.
Yeah, I think one thing that the cost, the water, and also the electricity right now is cheap. But when Colin was talking about, make me think of we watched a movie way back, the Rockefeller that went to China. They want everybody to use the oil lamp, and the oil is free. They give everybody the lamp, and after everybody addicted to it, and then they raise the price of the oil, and everybody could spend money. So now say, we, guilty as charged. I'm trying to make the tool as attractive as possible, but actually we make probably going to be people going to addicted to it, or you cannot go without it. And suddenly they say, oh, now you have to pay. So we're doing something good, but eventually we'll introduce this one. I'm not saying monster, but certainly it's the super costly, things to the education. That's I've never thought of those, but actually we're doing it. As learning scientists, we want to make this one as good as possible, right? But you're making it, think about that kind of consequences.
Absolutely. Yeah, the other thing is also, I think someone mentioned, and I think really agree with that point, it's multifaceted. And I think there's generally recently lots of conversations that have to basically always be binarized in a way. You are either bad or good. You are either with me or not. And so, for example, there's always that kind of conversation as well about generative AI or AI in general, that it's good or bad. Well, it depends. Like the same technology, like all these language technologies that are coming, and generative AI that is going to speech to text or vice versa, etc., is actually not going always to create digital divides. it's also going to include some people who are basically visually impaired or have some other forms of disabilities that actually are including them in a better way. And you can actually scale up some of that inclusion, while at the same time, what type of AI you can get access to and from what part of the world as well may create some forms of divides. So it's always basically kind of that tension that is out there, and nothing is binary. It's always kind of in a form of a spectrum that is there. The other thing is also that you, Shangan, mentioned is basically with respect to the making car driving. I'm sorry, you, David, mentioned it as well, about car driving and expecting something to be 100% safe. Current driving is not 100% safe. And also, I love the point that Harari makes in his Nexus book as well. We all know if we would make the speed limit of 3 miles per hour as the max speed limit, then we would have 100% safe driving everywhere. I mean, it would be almost nobody killed. So in the end of the day, we as the society need to negotiate some of these kind of social contracts and what is acceptable level of tolerance for certain types of things. The challenge with AI is that it's so new. I mean, it's not necessarily new as a technology or a way of creating algorithms, but it's so new to the society. And I think we need to go through many of these things. The question that I have is for many is the extent to which we need to, and I think Osama to a certain extent prompted that question as well, is licensing or anything that is like, for example, releasing open AI that is going to permeate almost everything we do in life without any trials, while a drug, relatively safe drug, has to go through so many trials and levels of trials. So do we need to introduce as a society something like that or not? Makes me wonder. But I think in education, we definitely are not doing sufficiently ways to do certain efficacy studies with certain technologies, yet education doesn't happen in vacuum, and schools and universities are not just in the vacuum.
I do want to
Well,
make
it's
one
funny-
analogy that I trying to convince myself. See, for the AI for education, so we are building educational, like resources. If I consider learning science, so we're producing things like tutoring systems, like it's resources for learning. Life learning sciences are like intellectual well-beings, and the life sciences are physiological well-being, and then in life sciences, we have resources, like medical resources. We have FDA. We identify potential, like harms. But in learning sciences, we do not have that. Now, if we really try to regulate, okay, so here we produce something, but it's we want to make sure that something can be used or not be used. It's almost like regulating, like FDA regulating, like medical resources. And that way, we probably can make sure that they use it right. Right now, everything we produce is like a nutrition product. Everybody can grab and you spend 2 hours or 2 hours a day for the entire year. Nobody notice, or you do not use it. Nobody notice either. But in the medical or life sciences, you have medicine that actually really, really powerful, and then can be prescribed versus nutritional products. So if our learning science mature at that level, we probably have a better situation right now. I don't think that we're not mature enough to have all the learning resources being very well studied or efficaciously, like clinically tried, and we do not identify the potential harm for.
I'm actually not sure. I agree with you on that, Cheng'en, because like I would argue that in most developed countries and developing countries, we really do have two education systems or learning sciences systems, right? We have the formal organized ones, and for the most part, state-run, with tests and verification for teachers and standards set by school boards, right? It's not like the school board is not an FDA, but they still filter what goes in. They still have an attempt to control it, right? And then alongside that, we have the huge supplement market for supplements and like unlicensed tutoring and get your kids to play with this toy and it'll make them smart. And, and teachers in schools have to deal with the fact that kids come in and they've been messing with all of that or been told to do all of that. And, you know, maybe they're right, they learned something and maybe they didn't, and I don't know. And so in a sense, it's kind of like a doctor's office when somebody comes in and says, well, I've been taking this whole bag of things I got down at the store. What's wrong with me? Right? We kind of have that problem. I would argue we have that problem in education, and the problem is almost be that the market for supplements is growing faster than the regulated market.
Yes.
It's not that there
Yes.
isn't regulation, it's just that it's behind.
Yeah.
I have to, you know, I'm in Boston. It's probably the latest for me here. My day started with a 5 a.m. call with Kazakhstan and ends at a midnight call with Hong Kong. But I would love, Professor Hu, I mean, if you can figure out a way to kind of synthesize out some of the major topics of discussion, and we do a follow-up, because it feels like there's some very beneficial things we can take away from the session and these different views, and maybe figure out a way to make them more accessible to others and even understand them ourselves. So I hope we do that.
Yeah,
And-
we're gonna do that. Professor Chan is here, and he's the one that actually, you know, set up this Harwell. I think this is a very productive and a very fruitful discussion and the presentation. Let's work on follow-ups.
Okay,
Yeah, sure.
thank you.
Okay, great.
I'll drop off, but you guys can
I
continue
think
away.
we also, we also need to, get to another place. So again, let's keep this discussion alive. And I think our discussion, you know, your views are certainly benefit beyond this group, you know, in the larger audiences. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks
Thank you very much. I enjoyed it.
Okay.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.